Hi, in this video we're going to look at website software. This will go with a similar video about website hardware, however together they'll simply be too big to actually do at once, so we'll concentrate initially on the software side. So the software part of this unit is looking at the P1 and P2 criteria for Unit 9 for the OCR Level 2, which is website development, and as I said, the software bit is slightly bigger of the two, so therefore it makes sense to actually cover this one first. Okay, so because it's in the unit, just look at the unit aim. So we're looking at knowing the website architecture and components. That's what we're specifically doing right now. Then we're going to understand how websites can be used by organizations. So the most common thing that you'll be thinking of most likely when you're thinking about why companies use websites is to sell stuff through things like e-commerce. It's not necessarily always the way, and sometimes a lot of the internet use and website use they do is actually internal. You don't actually get to see it particularly. We're going to be looking at designing and then creating websites. That will be towards the end of this unit and within the second assignment for me. But obviously, other people may decide to do the unit slightly differently. But certainly towards the end, we're going to be looking at designing and creating, and that should be quite interesting because it gives you a bit of freedom to actually design some stuff, which is always quite cool, I think. Okay, so let's make a start. First we're going to look at is the World Wide Web and the Internet. So these days you'll find that the World Wide Web and the Internet are used interchangeably by people. So when you say, for example, that you can't access the Internet, it's probably actually not true. You probably can access the Internet, but what you can't access is the World Wide Web. So the World Wide Web is part of the Internet. Okay, so the Internet is a much bigger thing. It's if you think of, say, a football league, then you might have a club which is part of that football league, and that's kind of like what the World Wide Web is. The World Wide Web is part of a much bigger thing, which is the Internet. And the Internet could be it doesn't have to be a web page. It's literally a network of networks that are connected together, and you can send all kinds of resources through that, communication, whatever it might be. Whereas the World Wide Web is specifically web content, such as web pages, which are created in a language called HTML, amongst other things, but predominantly HTML. And we'll obviously look at that later. We're going to have to, in order to make a web page. So, like I said, the World Wide Web is a subset of the Internet. It's actually it's not very old. I mean, if you think about the first web pages were in the mid 80s, and since then it's just kind of grown massively out of proportion, really, I suppose you could say. So very few people do not use the Internet these days. It's this, and especially things like mobile technology, is growing massively. So first of all, we're looking at a web server. So you'll find a web server can be used for either hardware or software. In this instance, we'll look at it as a piece of software, and in the later video we'll look at it as a piece of hardware. But a web server is something which serves your web page to a user, and ultimately, let's say, for example, any computer can become a web server, and when somebody requests a resource or a page or whatever it might be from you, it then serves that resource back to the end user. So let's say, for example, I type in www.bbc.co.uk into my computer. Then that request is then forwarded on to wherever that server may be. And then the BBC, they probably have multiple versions of it, and it's forwarded on by something called a router. You think of it almost as your sat nav. And then when that request gets to the server, it says, "Oh, we're looking for this page about, I don't know, technology," and then it serves it back to me again via routers. And this process happens very, very quickly. Commonly web pages load in a couple of seconds. So it's a pretty quick process. And you've got to remember that sometimes these servers are on the other side of the world. So the whole process is usually quite quick. Obviously, the bigger the web page, the slower this process is going to be, which is why sometimes you find some pages are loading slower, and also you are ultimately I can't think of exactly the right word, but basically the amount of traffic that is going to that particular server at any one point is also going to have an impact of it. So let's say if you have 10,000 people trying to access a certain web page on a server, again, that is going to have an impact, because if you think of it as like a road, if you have too much traffic on a road, then what ends up happening is that the road traffic slows down greatly, because there's too much traffic on there in order to kind of all go at the speed you want. And so that's part of the reason why you'll find it slowing down. You've got an internet service provider. So internet service providers will provide access to the internet. Usually they will charge you. There's very few ISPs do not charge you, and obviously packages vary greatly in cost, and with the difference in cost you get different availability of data. So you may have caps on how much you can download. You may have caps on speed, and as your package increases in cost, you tend to get much more availability for this. So the most popular ISP in the UK is BT, and then you've got Sky and Virgin. Those three, or these four, sorry, I missed out Talk there for a minute, are by far and away the most popular ones in the UK. And I think what you've got to also remember is that ultimately that figure comes to about 25 million, but generally one ISP will serve multiple people, so that pretty much covers most of the population, really. 9.3 million from BT, I would hazard a guess, is quite a way down on what it would have been 10 years ago. I would have thought 10 years ago it would cover most of the UK, but these days, although it's still the most popular one, the others are growing in popularity. This is just a survey from Ofcom, which looked at general kind of things about internet service providers. So, for example, when you're looking at satisfaction, PlusNet are the ones that have the highest satisfaction. Now, I must admit I have no experience with PlusNet, but I do have experience with BT and Sky from personal perspective, and I've always found them to be okay. Although the average waiting call of 1 minute 27 for BT is a bit less than I've experienced in the past, but it is what it is. I found it quite interesting, really, and actually what you're getting there is generally people are pretty satisfied. 80% general satisfaction is pretty high as a rule. So you've got databases. Databases are where you would store data that you have acquired from a website. So websites themselves have nowhere to store your data. They need, if you're taking information in via a form or ordering something, you need to store it somewhere, which is going to be used in a database. So you've got common databases such as MySQL. SQL stands for Structured Query Language, which you would cover. It's a level 3 and 4 topic. You would cover that later on. SQL is really, really straightforward to do. Oracle, and very occasionally Access is a very basic database. Generally, if you have quite a lot of files stored on it, you wouldn't actually use it, but it does the job on occasion. And you need a web server to be able to actually do any of that, because if you just use the standard web language, which is HTML with CSS, cascading style sheets, basically HTML is the way it's structured, CSS is the way it looks, and we'll cover it in more detail later on in the course. They actually don't do any processing, so you need a server to actually, let's say for example customers filled in all their details on a web page, you need the web server to actually make it do something. So to take it from the web page into a database, you need a server. Now a web server is beyond what we're going to cover at level 2. However, it's certainly something that you could start looking at if you're interested in becoming a web developer at level 3. Things like the WAMP suite, WAMP, would allow your computer to become a web server, and it doesn't cost you any money, but it is a fairly complex thing, so it's not something that you would just understand straight off the bat. It is something you'll need to actually look at and take some time to learn. You got web editors. You're going to become very familiar with these. So something called WYSIWYG, which stands for What You See Is What You Get editors. And basically what you get here is the option to have a visual representation of the web page shown to you as you're designing it, called the design view generally. And I've given examples of Dreamweaver and Visual Studio here. There are others. I didn't say that right, but there are others, such as Expression and so on. Generally, Dreamweaver is by far and away the most popular one. I would always suggest to my students that although there is that representation there, you've always got to save it and preview it in a browser. Always preview it in a browser, because the design view only works a fraction of the time, to be pretty honest, in my experience. And then you've got text-based editors such as Sublime Text, and you've got Notepad or Notepad++, and again there are other versions of that literally is just the text, and you'll need to save it and open it up in a browser. It's quite a good thing to get used to, because actually you'll learn more about the actual language that you're using, rather than just relying on things like drag and drop. Ultimately, if you're going to have a career in this thing, you need to learn the language. There's no kind of getting around that. There is no shortcut. You need to actually learn the language, and things like text-based editors will help you do that, even if they are slightly harder to use, especially to begin with, than the WYSIWYG editors. You've got domain name. So what you have to remember is that when you're putting in your web address, so for example here, www.example.com. Okay, if you're actually going to put that in, it's not actually really that. Okay, the web address is actually a number, so for called an IP address, Internet Protocol address, and humans are not very good at remembering these numbers. I mean, if you think about the number of people that have issues remembering things like phone numbers, IP addresses are going to be harder than that, because there are many more websites out there than phone numbers that you'll need, and you're simply not going to remember them. Have to be realistic about this. So therefore we turn the IP address, or attach the IP address to a domain name, which could be anything you want, really. I mean, it's good practice to have a domain name which is relevant to your website. There is absolutely no point in having a domain name that does not reflect your website. That's just foolish. The first .com account, so .com is the most prestigious one. It is known worldwide, and it's what we call a top level domain. Again, the whole issue about top level domains is a level 3 topic, to be brutally honest with you. But you've seen in the past that there are various different other types of domains: .co.uk, .net, .ac.uk, and so on. .com is the oldest, most prestigious, and the oldest .com account was created in 1986 as a computer company called Symbolics. These guys are no longer in existence, unfortunately. I believe they went out of existence in about the mid-1990s. But yeah, 98. So it's not very old at all. I believe it's 32 years at the time of recording. Now, the whole theories behind domain names itself, so you don't really need to worry about that at level 2. It's more of a level 3 topic. But just be aware that there are, ultimately a domain name is an IP address, and you need a domain name in order to help people remember where your website is. Generally, you have to pay for a domain name. The more in demand the domain name is, the higher it's going to cost. I've seen some domain names costing thousands of pounds, whereas I'm quite lucky with my website. When I paid a bill, it only costs me something like $7 or $8 a year, because nobody else kind of shares my name, so that's quite nice. Alright, so web hosting. So a web host is where your website is stored. Any computer can be a web host, and it's not the same as an ISP. Okay, a web host is where you store your website and make it available to other people to view. So while any computer can do this, you need to understand that actually setting this up is quite complex, and also you have to bear in mind things such as security. If you are allowing other people to look at your computer, you have to remember that they then therefore could potentially quite easily view other files on your machine, which could be not what you want. It could be sensitive stuff. I mean, yeah, who knows? Or they could access things on that you have installed on your machine, such as websites and passwords and so on. And you don't really want that. Web hosts will let people hire space on their servers for websites to be stored. Generally, you're going to have to pay for that. And similar to ISPs, the more you pay, generally, the more you're going to get in return, such as help desk facilities, content management systems, especially things like WordPress. WordPress is a method of making websites which is quite useful. And examples that you have here are oneonone.com and GoDaddy. You've probably seen GoDaddy adverts on the TV. There are other ones out there. Generally, it's not too expensive. Usually you're looking at 10-20 quid a month, which isn't too bad. But you have to really kind of make use of it. Otherwise, it might be quite an expensive error. But that's up to you, really. Just a couple of bits to look at before we finish off. You could talk about WAMP or LAMP. So basically the same thing, but LAMP is used on Linux systems, WAMP is used on Windows, and it's basically a suite of open source resources such as PHP, which is pre-hypertext processor, a web server language, which actually helps you make you do stuff like ASP.NET. They do the same thing, they're just different languages. MySQL, the database, Apache, which is a Linux-based bit of software, and the idea is that they help turn the machines into web servers, and they are meant to make it easier, and they do make it easier, but ultimately it's still going to be relatively complex because you need to get all the settings right. To allow people to actually access the stuff on your machine, you have to get the folder structure right and so on and so forth. I'd have a look at it if you're interested in this sort of thing, but you can also use Visual Studio to achieve a similar type of effect. It's a temporary one, but it will run a temporary web server on their machines, which can be quite useful just to kind of get an idea. Web 2.0 is covered by the awarding body. I mean, really, it's out of date. Let's be honest. Basically, when the web was first invented, all the pages were static, didn't do anything, and it was great for a bit. But in the long run, it needed to reinvent itself because the .com bubble burst in about turn of the century, and Web 2.0 was eventually reborn, where web pages reacted to what a user had done in the past. So, for example, if I had gone onto Amazon and I'd searched Lord of the Rings, then when I went onto Amazon in the future, it would say, "Oh, look, you've looked at Lord of the Rings. Here are other fantasy books you may like, or here is The Hobbit, or here are other books by Tolkien, who's the author of Lord of the Rings." Now, in recent years, it's actually passed on to Web 3.0 because it's gone beyond that, but the actual awarding bodies are a bit slow on the uptake with this, and you won't see Web 3.0 in many places. And basically what you're looking at is the web is now everywhere. You're looking at theories such as IoT, Internet of Things, and it's everywhere you go. You get suggestions on your phone when you're walking down the high street and go, you bought a Blu-ray the other day and you're passing HMV, and this is what you could buy from here. So it is basically everywhere now. So it's just something to bear in mind. While the awarding body will ask you to look at Web 2.0, in reality the world has moved on from there into Web 3.0, and who knows where we're going to go in the future. Really, it'll be an interesting thing to see. Finally, you've got blogs and wikis, two pretty straightforward things. Blogs means weblog, like an online diary. So websites such as Blogger, you will be able to do that with. And obviously, compared with a written diary, it has greatly improved accessibility, functionality, and so on. You can make it look beautiful. You can have various different links to various places. So if you're reviewing the latest computer game, you could potentially link to where you could buy that from. You can give other people the chance to come in and comment on what you're saying. But obviously, if you're having that accessibility, then you could have issues with security and what you call internet trolls, who are people who come on and intentionally provoke. Microblogging, so things like Twitter and Instagram and so on, are quite popular among things like celebrities and businesses, because they allow subliminal messaging and their kind of ideas to be given to a large number of people very quickly, very cheaply, because Twitter doesn't cost anything, or neither really do things like Instagram and Snapchat and so on. And some people have millions and millions of followers, and you can get a message to all these people just by making a post, which is unbelievable. Wikis are like an open source resource that many people can contribute to. Obviously, the most famous one is Wikipedia, but there are other examples out there. If you're thinking about things which are quite big, so let's say, for example, I'm a big fan of things like the Witcher series. You can find a wiki out there dedicated to The Witcher, and we'll talk about things like the lore and the characters and so on. But it's not Wikipedia, but it is a wiki, and it's quite an interesting thing to look at and contribute to, and so on. Okay, so I've come to the end of this set of slides, and like I said, this is mainly concentrating on the software because we're covering two different criteria. There's a lot of software to cover, and I would recommend with all of this, we're looking mainly at descriptions and definitions, but actually if you are interested in this topic, then you will need to go out there and actually look at developing some of this stuff. There's lots of different websites out there, like W3 Schools, which is very good at teaching you how to do things like web development. But with the next video, we're going to look at hardware. Well, thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you soon.